Hello, everybody. Good morning. It's such a pleasure to be here with all of you today for this really interesting session on just transition, metrics and outcomes. How do we know if we're on the right path? I'm Bella Tonkanogi. I'm the director at Climate Policy Initiative. We're a nonprofit analytical and advisory organization focused on climate finance. I'm really pleased to be here to moderate the session and the discussion today. There's a lot to talk about and a really fantastic panel to help us wrestle with some of these questions that we are asking. Before we get to the panel, I'm very pleased to welcome Anil Kishora, who's the Vice President and Chief Risk Officer of NDB, New Development Bank. Um, in this role, reporting to the president, he's currently responsible for the bank's risk management strategy, policies, partnerships, and ESG functions. So thank you so much, and thank you for welcoming us today.
Dr. Crispian Olver, Executive Director, Presidential Climate Commission. Mr. Vincent Gilles, CFO Infinity. Incidentally, he consumed no carbon in coming to this event. He is based out of Dubai. Gareth Phillips, Ms. Bella Tonkonogi, who is going to moderate this fabulous, fantastic panel. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I'm honored to welcome you all as participants and distinguished panelists to this side event, co-hosted by the New Development Bank and the Presidential Climate Commission of South Africa. An event like this An event like this is not only critical to our journey of transitioning to a low carbon emission development trajectory, but also provides an opportunity for us to pause and ask ourselves, are we doing the right things? Are we going the right direction? A few months back, as NDB, in our effort to strengthen partnerships and ensure thorough understanding of the needs of our member country clients, we were kindly received by Dr. Crispian Olver and his team at PCC. In the fruitful discussions we had, it became clear that the determination and definition of key metrics by which we can assess our progress towards a fair and just transition is quite crucial. The event is therefore an outcome of the efforts of our colleagues in these two institutions who put their minds together and brought together the most relevant experts in the climate change field, yourselves, the audience, and key players represented by our distinguished panelists to share lessons on three aspects basically: the key priorities of a just and fair transition, the understanding of what these priorities mean, and the expectations or resultant goals for different stakeholders, such as businesses, different sectors, and the workforce. How stakeholders can assess their progress and provide assurance that they are in the right direction towards a just and fair transition. As you are aware, emerging markets and developing countries struggle with allocation of their limited resources to competing economic and social needs. They further find themselves in a tight spot as they are committed to meeting climate expectations and the Paris alignment's goals. Transition to greener globe is a must for all of us. And to succeed in that transition, it got to be a fair and just transition. Stakeholders need to constantly assess the progress made towards this. In this context, we note with inspiration the work that some of the countries have done so far in defining their just transition frameworks. We eagerly wait to hear from Dr. Ulver about the work done in South Africa and how the priorities have been defined and related matters. The business and energy sectors are also well represented today. They will enlighten us on how they have translated the JT transition priorities into their operating environments and how they intend to provide assurance to their key stakeholders that they will transition to a low emission pathway whilst meeting the demands of their customers and other partners. As a MDB, our mandate is to mobilize resources for infrastructure and sustainable development. Climate is an inherent, most critical part of sustainability. Recognizing this, we have allocated 40% of our lending targets to climate finance over the period 2022-2026. We have further worked with other MDBs uh, to develop and publish high level principles for supporting a just transition in our client countries. We know that different parties, be it countries, companies, DFIs, or others, are engaged one way or another in the journey of transitioning. A methodology that will converge these efforts to a certain common point will help all the key players to determine whether they have achieved their goals. Metrics or indicators that are smart, reliable, can be communicated to and clearly understood by all parties can help us navigate our way better. Let me reference a few data points before I conclude. In 2020, Germany passed its coal phase out law. Alongside, it also enacted another law called a Structural Support to Coal Regions Act. The final timeline for complete phase out is 2038. The law was passed in 2020. The timeline is 2038, which means 18 years. The total cost is variously estimated between $72 billion dollars to $107 billion. The number of people employed in Germany, I understand, across the value chain is about 60 to 86,000. I wonder what would be realistically the timeline and the cost for a just transition in a country like South Africa, India, or China, where coal is a big source of energy and employment. On a positive note, the International Partners Group, comprising France, Germany, UK, US, Denmark, and the Netherlands, are pursuing a program in South Africa to realize a just transition. Total financing commitments from the expanded IPG are now around $9.3 billion. It's a kind of pilot, it's kind of an experiment, which will provide us deep insights into the journey of just transition. A ton of carbon emission reduced anywhere on the planet helps us all across borders. The cost of such reduction is much lower in the global south, and therefore we expect more such partnerships to follow and hopefully succeed. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is against this backdrop that I welcome you all and wish you a very fruitful deliberation to you. Thank you very much, and over to Bella for an interesting and fruitful discussion. Thank you.
Great. Do we have our last speaker is here? Oh, wonderful. Great. No, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great. So we are going to have a really interesting conversation today. I'm so glad that we have these four speakers here. Let me Like, do you need something here? Sorry. I thought you wanted me over here. Getting situated. Give us 1 second. So, joined by four very distinguished panelists today to talk about exactly how Anil set us up for this discussion. Really, what does that J in just transition, what does a just and just transition really mean? How do we measure it? How do we know that we are progressing against it? How do we monitor, evaluate it? I think this discussion will hopefully give us some ideas for that. I'm pretty sure in saying we don't have all the answers, right? And this is because this topic is so it's so current, right? We are all working through it together. And so I'm really looking forward to the ideas of the panelists, their experiences, lessons learned. We'll bring in the audience a bit during the discussion as well. So if you do have questions, please hold on to those and we will get to some audience participation. Absolutely. For us at CPI, we've really had the pleasure of working with the South African government and South African research partner organizations for a number of years. We did some studies about 5 years ago on transition risk in South Africa. And actually, later today, we're launching a South African climate finance landscape where we're really looking at the climate finance flows in South Africa and helping the government and partners in South Africa really measure the finance flow progress, but it doesn't get to this question of the justice part and how do we measure that? It's the quantity of finance, but not actually the quality of finance. So, again, really excited about this conversation. Looking forward to hearing from the panelists. Let me introduce them now. So we have over at the end, we have Crispian Olver, the Executive Director of the Presidential Climate Commission of South Africa. We have right here to my left, Mr. Calib Cassim, the Acting Group Executive Officer of Eskom Holdings. Right here to my right, we have Vincent Gilles, who's the Chief Financial Officer of Infinity, which is a solar and wind developer and operator on the African continent. And so a very crucial part of the transition. And then finally, we have Gareth Phillips, who's the manager of Green Growth and Environment. Did I get that right, more or less?
With
Climate and
finance.
Environment at the African Development Bank. So we'll help us both zoom in on South Africa, but also zoom out and really think about the just transition across the continent. So let me start with Crispian. Um, so you've been really at the forefront of just transition and really thinking through what it means and really working to bring together partners to figure it out and implement it in South Africa. And South Africa has really been at the forefront of all of these conversations globally. So I would love to hear from you as you have been thinking about the monitoring and evaluation and really defining the just and just transition. What are some of the challenges you've encountered and some of the lessons learned?
Sure, thank you. And very good morning, everyone. And a particular word of gratitude to Anil and the New Development Bank. You know, the idea for this dialogue, he and I had a conversation on the sidelines of the BRICS summit in Johannesburg. And it's brilliant that, you know, you carried that through. And the central issue that we were discussing was, you know, this is in many senses uncharted territory for many of us. We're all trying to grapple with what does the just transition really mean? How do we deliver it? And very importantly, how do we measure and track it so that we know where we're going to? And it's, I think, fundamentally important that we do more of these kinds of exchanges. We're all innovating and learning as we go. And if we're not exchanging information, we're going to, you know, keep having to go through that initial investment. So I want to give you some reflections around tracking. But maybe to start with, South Africa. I think most of you know we launched this idea of a JET-P, a Just Energy Transition Partnership at COP26. We were able to get commitments for 8.5 billion of dollars of grant, concessional and debt finance. We've recently launched a detailed implementation plan linked to that JET-P. It sets out a funding requirement of $100 billion going into electrification, upgrading the grid, electric vehicles, and green hydrogen. And embedded in that plan is not just a theory of change, but quite a detailed M&E system. And I think it makes for, if you're interested in it, it's not perfect, but if you're interested in this discussion of how do we measure and track, there's, I think, a very good first attempt set out in that document. And I do want to urge you to read it and have a look at it. But let me grapple with some of the conceptual issues that we've been trying to come to terms with. So, and it starts with what we mean by a just transition, and I'm going to give you a sort of one sentence definition. It's basically about looking at the climate transition through the lens of development. It's understanding the social and the economic consequences of this transition and working out how we manage them. And for developing countries, well, I mean, for all countries, but certainly from us in the global south, if this transition is not addressing national development questions, it's not going to go anywhere. We can't sell it. We can't scale up ambition. And I know there's been a lot of concern echoing around the rooms here in this conference that, somehow the developing world is trying to water down ambition by focusing on justice. It's completely the wrong way of looking at it. Justice and ambition go hand in hand, and the one enables the other. Now, if you're seeing it in that perspective of development, on the face of it, we've already got a highly developed set of indicators. So we've got the SDGs. They track very important things like poverty and inequality, maternal and child health, women's education. And these are fundamental parts of how we broadly measure developmental progress. You've also got a very well-developed set of ESG metrics, which financial sector and all of the DFIs subscribe to and have integrated into their systems. But there are a couple of areas around the just transition that we don't track with those metrics. And I'm going to reduce it to three broad principles. So we adopted a just transition framework. It sets out three broad principles. Those principles are procedural justice. So how do we make sure that people that are most vulnerable in this transition are able to participate in the decisions about how the transition unfolds? And that works at a project level. So, when we're going in and designing projects, how do people on the ground have a say and take ownership of those projects? And it plays out also at a country level. So we hear a lot from people on the ground, workers, communities. They feel that this global elite that is gathered in these rooms are somehow making decisions on their behalf, and they're not party to them. So we have to track, not just are we consulting, are we involving people, but we also have to understand perceptions, and perceptions count in this transition. We also talk about the distributive justice. Now, distributive justice is making sure that the risks and the opportunities in this transition are equitably shared. And to be specific about it, are we localizing supply chains linked to the new energy, low carbon, resilient economy? Um, and are we creating local jobs in those sectors that offset the very substantial job losses we know are coming down the pipe in terms of fossil fuels and petrochemicals and other sectors that are going to be hammered by this transition? So it's about tracking livelihoods in relation to the sectoral economic shifts that are taking place. And then there's a third dimension to justice, which we call restorative justice, which is, as we exit these sectors, how do we take the land and the air sheds and the watersheds back, not just to the state that they were, but in a way that restores the people that live and occupy those areas to a more climate resilient form. So, how do we build community resilience and the assets that communities need? Now, all of these are very difficult areas to measure because we've got metrics that track global employment and national employment, but we don't have easily calculable metrics for looking at the supply chains in the context of a very unequal global trading and financial system. Um, and we don't have easy metrics for tracking community resilience and the way that we build that on the ground. So that's just some initial framing from our side and the kinds of things we're grappling with, and which we'd love to hear from others as we take this discussion forward.
Thank you so much, Crispian. It's really interesting to hear your framework and actually how and these levels of justice, right? It's not just about delivering jobs or just about delivering resilience. It's about and it's certainly not just about participation, but it's actually bringing it all together. It's very nice. It's great that you have thought those through and have set up that framework. Let me turn now to Vincent. You are a developer, so you are building in communities. You're building solar farms, you're building wind farms. You need the participation, the agreement of communities in your work. And I'm curious how you bring that in and how you think about how you think about that justice and just transition as a business.
Okay, I don't know if you can hear me. And if you heard that Finnish people are very quiet, it's probably not true. Yeah, the problem with the I would say the definition of the just transition is just trying to define what just actually means for a company. Because I would say from the political angle, even from the lender's angle, it's actually pretty easy. From a company's point of view, it's slightly more complicated. So it reminds me a bit of this 1964 US judge when he was asked to define adult material. He said, I don't know what porn is, but I can feel it when I see it. It's exactly the same. So what does it mean? Basically, you got the external and the internal dimension. External, pretty easy. You have rules that are incredibly prescriptive in countries like South Africa or Senegal, where we are very active. Surprisingly just. And I will let you explain how you've come to all these rules. But these rules usually are fairly easy to apply. And you know very quickly if you're not actually doing your job properly because either the lenders or the government comes to you and say, you could do a better job. So that's the external thing. Internal, it becomes a lot more interesting in the sense that you have to treat people well, pay people well, try to hire local talent, whatever the word talent could mean, develop people, because it's always very easy to say we're going to hire locally, but if you don't have the right qualifications, make sure people actually get to the right qualification and make sure you keep them. So that's one of the elements. The second element, which is most of the time misunderstood, is we're in 2023. And if you want to keep and hire good people, internally, you have to demonstrate in most of the interviews, wherever you are in the world, that you actually are part of just transition. And it's something that always strikes me. So my kids are 25 plus. And when they go to an interview, they actually ask questions about ESG, just transition, community work. And I say, why don't you ask about the salary first? So the salary is only secondary. That I mean, you're obsessed with it. But reality of it is today, it is important within the company. And it's important from 2 points of view. In a country like, in the countries we're active in Africa, South Africa, Senegal mainly, the good guys are not that many. And if you do not have this internal dimension, they will probably switch at some stage to another company. Replacing a good guy costs you a lot of money. Second thing is attracting younger generations. We will have the talent to develop. Same, as I just said, they ask you these questions. You need to make sure you can prove that you're actually doing it. So the tick the box that we saw so many times is not possible any longer. So then I'll come back to your tracking point, which is an incredibly important thing because as companies, we all always are tempted to say, we've been requested to do this, we have committed to doing that, and oh, we just do it. But we are gradually spending more and more time and money tracking what happened 3 or 4 years later. So typically last night until 11 p.m., I had an ENS committee in Senegal, and we have irrigation programs. We spend about €500,000 in irrigation every year in Senegal. We've been doing that for 3 years. Actually, part of last night's discussion was actually, does it work? How does that work? How many people have benefited, etc., etc. So I think that the tracking adds a lot of credentials or credibility to the just transition.
That's very interesting. It's probably important that you are an operator, right? So you continue to be there operating your facilities and need to continue to have that community support for the work that you're doing and to show that you are meeting those expectations of the workers, of the
It's incredibly, your reputation as a company takes ages to develop, but it takes a minute to destroy. And always keep that in mind as a company because it's so easy. You have one big problem. Would it be internal or external? Particularly in South Africa, where people sometimes tend to really focus quite a lot on these issues, and you may end up having so much more to rebuild. So that's why you need to be, I hate this expression, but laser focused on that issue and do not neglect it just because it costs a bit of money, it costs a bit of time, and eventually you feel you've ticked all the boxes, you don't need to do more. Well, actually, always try to do a bit more because it's very important, especially for a company like ours you never heard of before this panel.
that is true. That is very true. Let me turn to Caleb. Yes. So, I mean, you are in a very interesting company and very interesting people in your company. I mean, give us your reflections on this topic. Would love to hear it. What you are thinking about when you're thinking about just transition, how it's going. Tell us.
Yeah, thanks. So definitely, where we find ourselves as Eskom and also being such a key contributor to the economy and our non-performance is fundamental to the challenges in terms of economic growth. So firstly, as we appreciate and we fully support the just energy transition, first and foremost, we need to balance this trilemma of energy security with the number of interruptions in terms of load shedding. So, as Crispian has said, post COP26, when we also developed our just energy transition part, we recognize that first and foremost, we need to slow down a bit in terms of the shutting down of power stations. But we do appreciate, being 100 years old, the stations are coming towards the end of their lives. And we need to balance that low carbon trajectory going forward and contributing to the country's emission goals. Obviously, with Eskom producing just under 50% of the emissions in the country, if we don't succeed, South Africa is not going to succeed. So we recognize that. But in doing and the slowing down for now, it doesn't mean we must stop all the planning and the implementation and being ready to execute when the time comes. And the time will be soon. But importantly, the challenge we have You've got a workforce of 40,000 people, and within the generation environment, where you got 15,000 people, they want to know that they have a future in the generation part of Eskom. And what we do support and what we've built, whereas previously we've kept the Just Energy Transition Division at a corporate level, we've now brought it back into generation to show them that the just part is linked to generation to give you a second life. It's not separate. We're not ignoring you. We need to take you on this journey, but more importantly, you need to work with your staff, you need to work with your unions and all your stakeholders. The biggest learning for Eskom in doing our first project of Kamati was we should have started much more earlier. That's the biggest lesson. It We underestimate the work that's required in terms of getting the communities on board and getting them on board early. You know, it's one thing to say you are consulting or you informing. Informing someone tells you this is what I'm going to do, whether you like it or not. And then I think that's a fundamental difference. You must really transparently engage with the communities, listen to them, and bring them on board from the start. I think more importantly, you couple this with the issues of unemployment and communities that exist because of that power station. We don't want to exacerbate the situation in South Africa. We need to ensure, as part of our just energy transition, let's decouple repurposing and repowering from shutting down. So the first thing to do is let's repurpose the stations. And while we're doing that, we need to ensure you bring your own staff and the community as the reskilling, the training facilities, etc. They can see things that are happening on the ground that'll ensure that ecosystem around that community continues. I think that's the first and foremost issue. The second issue, as we go, this is the start of a journey. We haven't done this before in Eskom. So as Crispian has said, we are learning as South Africa. What is critical is over the next decade, a number of stations are going to come to an end. And when they come to an end, you're replacing coal baseload capacity with a, a large extent of renewables. You need to couple that with backup facilities like battery energy storage. You need some transition fuels in this mix going forward, that at the end of the day, you do have an electricity system that is also integrated, but more importantly, it talks to the transmission grid in terms of stability. So those are the big challenges. But at the end of the day, the worst thing, although we are slowing down, we must not stop planning and planning for execution. So as and when a station comes to the end of its life in 3 years or 4 years' time, we've done a lot of the groundwork, so it's seamless going forward, and the the customer, the community, the supply chain can see what is happening. It needs to be visible, but more importantly, people must feel part of this journey, and that at the end of the day, there is a second life beyond coal from a country perspective, but more importantly, from a community and an economic system perspective. It's easier said than done. With this, we do appreciate it comes at significant costs, and you need to balance that cost with the sustainability of Eskom going forward, taking into account the environment in which we are operating, with our debt conditions, our balance sheet, etc. Having said all of that, I think from an electricity industry and an energy industry in South Africa, this is an exciting time, and it's a time for opportunities. As a country, we must not miss these opportunities because it can generate and can stimulate the industrialization of the renewable sector in South Africa going forward, coupled with other transition sectors. And again, as Eskom, we know we can't do this alone. We need partners, and funding models around public private partnerships are critical going forward.
Thank you so much. I think there's some really interesting kind of metrics, maybe not so traditional, right? They're not necessarily counting jobs, but it's thinking about time, thinking about stability, thinking about that in the context of a lot of different definitions of sustainability. Certainly a lot more to explore with what you just said. Maybe moving over to Gareth. The African Development Bank group is working across the continent with a number of countries. You've been thinking about just transition frameworks. Um, be curious about your experiences, maybe some of the challenges and lessons learned that your group has developed or understood as you've been going through this.
Very much indeed, Bella, and thanks for inviting me to be on the panel today. So, well, I think this is very interesting. I've listened carefully to the previous speakers, and I want to pick up first on some of the points that they make. I think Crispian's point on the three procedural justice, distributive and restorative justice. This keeps coming up again, and actually, I think it's really fundamentally important that we understand the consequences of this. The procedural justice, about reaching out to stakeholders and improving the consultation. So, we've all done stakeholder consultation in developing projects and so on, but really this moves it to a new level because we have to do, well, it's more extensive. We have to do, identify our stakeholders and get their input to a much greater extent. But it may even also extend to having to educate them about the issues around climate change, because how can they express their opinions and come up with suggestions to address how they might respond in a situation of climate change if they don't have an understanding of what it means. And I mean, we all have I assume everybody here has a good grasp of the implications of changing climate and what it may mean. But, farmers in Africa or laborers, people working in power plants and so on, they don't necessarily understand what those issues are. So, the procedural element of raising awareness and collecting that input is an enormous task. Then the distributive justice and how we ensure that the sort of the benefits and the costs are equally shared is very interesting. And here at the African Development Bank, what the work that we've done has focused not only on fossil fueled economies, but also on non-fossil fueled economies, because they're quite different. When you look at that in a fossil fueled economy, and we heard from Caleb about 40,000 employees, 15,000 in the generation sector. Those are jobs that need to be created. But in many African countries that aren't fossil fueled, they don't have the jobs in the first instance. So, it's a broader definition of a just transition. It's not just about protecting jobs, but it's about finding out about all those informal people that are working around that economic sector and finding out how they are going to be impacted. For example, one of the areas we're working on just now, we're piloting the Climate Investment Fund's Just Transition Toolbox in Uganda in the transport sector. And I mean, the transport sector is incredibly complex. You've got, taxi drivers who, at least from what I gather, many of them are illiterate, and so they're not in a good position to understand what the consequences are. But they're about to be put out of a job when you're going to install a metro or a mass rapid transport system. Then behind them are all the people who are maintaining the vehicles, the people who are investing in those vehicles and making a living from running them, the bicycles, the motorbikes, and so on. Then that impacts upon the transport sector for charcoal coming in, and so it just balloons out to see the number of people that are actually involved in the transport sector who are going to be impacted by a project. So we need to understand what the impacts are going to be on those people, and we're going to have to design the projects to take consideration of those. And then on the restorative justice, what do we actually do to provide them with low carbon, climate resilient jobs in the future, and to help them. So what strikes me now about all this is, and this is bad news for sort of engineers who kind of see a solution to a problem and want to move forward. you have to stop. You can't come up with a solution. You've got to do all this stakeholder consultation and go through these processes before you design the solution. And that's going to be very difficult because we're all keen to get on. We see the problem. We see what we want to do to solve it. But actually, we've got to do a huge amount of consultation before we can move forward with designing that solution. I think that goes back to what Caleb said about wishing that they'd started earlier, getting the stakeholders on board sooner. It's very tempting to say, yeah, this is the solution to the problem, but we have to remember we're not the ones that have to design the solution. We have to reach out and go through these processes. So I think that this is the magnitude of this challenge. I think is kind of dawning on us, and it's going to require a lot of work. It's going to slow down project preparation. It's going to increase the costs of that. It's already difficult to design bankable projects. Designing a just bankable project is now going to be more demanding. It's going to take longer, and we need to get started on it sooner. Of course, I mean, it's not all bad news. We've got toolboxes, we've got frameworks, we'll gain experience and so on. I'm sure we'll overcome the challenge. But right now, I think that's really something that's quite pressing. I think it was very interesting to hear Vincent talking about how do we assess what is just and what is good quality finance, what is just climate finance, and I think the use of theories of change to identify outputs, outcomes, and impacts, I think, is critical. And I know you referred, Crispian, in the document from South Africa, you have an extensive theory of change. In the framework that we have at the African Development Bank, we also require a theory of change. And I think this is a very positive way to approach the identification of outputs and outcomes. And we shouldn't get bogged down in trying to find uniform metrics. Because if we go down that rabbit hole, we'll never come out of it. There is no single metric to assess just transition. It's going to be messy. It's going to be like the Sustainable Development Goals. We have 140 parameters that we can measure under the SDGs, and we're going to have a lot of parameters that we can measure under the just transition frameworks and so on. So the point is to ensure that we have a robust theory of change, that theory of change is informed by the host country, not by the developers coming in. It's got to be a bottom-up process. And we pick indicators coming from the outputs and the outcomes, hopefully that are cheap and easy to measure, and that we are confident lead to the long-term impact. So, employment is an obvious one, and it's very easy to gather centralized data on the number of employees, to have the amount of jobs that are created. It's easy to gather that information, and then we can supplement that with interviews and so on as necessary. But that's a very cheap and easy thing to measure to give a good indication of people that are transitioning to jobs. And I'm sure there's other indicators that we can come up with. But the point is, we need to find cheap and easy indicators that we're confident will yield or will lead to those impacts. And then maybe, I already talked a little bit about the non-fossil fueled economies. I think that it's important, although we focused here on just energy transition, the language in the Paris Agreement doesn't have the energy bit. They just talk about just transition. So just transition isn't just in the energy sector. We tend to lean that way because that's where the jobs are, and the traditional definition of just transition relates to jobs and protecting people who have jobs as they move to clean economies, clean employment opportunities and industries. But as I say, many countries don't have the jobs in the first place, so we need to broaden that definition of just transition to ensure that we reach out to sectors of society that aren't otherwise represented. And I think that will be a great opportunity to do more for women and youth. Because traditionally they're overlooked in these activities, but it's a great chance to make sure that we identify what their needs are and do our best to address those. So let me stop there and hand back to you, Bella, and we have another round. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Gareth. It's interesting, all four of you, especially the last three speakers, really refer to the time and cost elements of of doing it right and doing it well. And I'm sitting here reflecting on it, thinking about how the relates to the need for speed and the need for scale we kind of hear in the climate change discussions, and how do we bring all of that together? It's not so simple, as I think you've all learned over the last years. And I'm curious, maybe going back to you, Crispin, and how you're thinking about some of those questions. Also thinking about, as the government of South Africa really and all of the partners kind of work together with the global financial institutions, international financial institutions, some of the international investors, how you think about how your work with them and how to balance all the time, the cost, the investment returns, the need to really develop strong, good projects. Is it fit for purpose? How can we better, how can we better work as a system so we can achieve all of these different objectives that are we hope are going to be aligned with each other, right? But actually sometimes with the devil in the details, it's not so straightforward. And so I think it'd be great to hear your reflections on that. After you, I'm open to the three of you kind of coming in. I want this to be a little bit of a discussion. So, just tell me who wants to go next as you're thinking about Crispin, and we can kind of have a little discussion and then turn over to the audience to hear some of your questions and thoughts as well. So over to you.
Sure. So look, my blunt assessment after 2 years of haggling over this jetty and trying to put the implementation plan together is that the finance that is on offer is completely mismatched to the need. And it's taken us an enormous amount of time to get all of these bits and bobs that, form part of the 8.5 billion. And, we say 8.5, but it really was a set of very disparate bilateral offers that weren't integrated, didn't work together, and didn't do the primary thing, which was to leverage up the $100 billion that we need. And, so we've got to think about finance in a way that, we're trying to tap South Africa is blessed with these very deep capital markets. We power a lot of Southern Africa's economy through our markets. But the package didn't play into that strength. It didn't take the 100 billion as the focus. So, and when you add the just dimension into projects, you're adding some things that financiers don't really like. So, the ticket sizes are a little bit small. It takes a lot longer to develop projects, so the pipeline is slower than people want. There's a different kind of risk profile. Projects are not as commercially viable as others. So I think we've got to, if we want to start making jet keys a little bit more widely applicable and fit for purpose, we do need to do some fundamental rethinking about how to structure the money. And, for Africa, it's very important. There's a $1.5 trillion financing need if we're going to implement all of the NDCs that African countries have come up with. So we need $1.5 trillion by 2030. At the moment, Africa gets, I think about 2.5% of global trade. The CBAMs that are being implemented. I mean, the last research report I saw, about 30% of Africa's trade is exposed to negative effects from CBAM. And, what you saw coming out of the Nairobi Declaration, I mean, a slight shift away from, this cap in hand begging for handouts and saying, we want to grow our economies. We want to participate in the global trading system. But Africa's being hobbled from the core ambition, which is, to make our economies work. Africa only gets 3% of global climate finance. Compared to 80, Africa's got 18% of the world's population. 3% of climate finance goes to Africa. So there's a bigger architectural problem. The global financial architecture and trade architecture doesn't enable this continent to play equitably. And, just transitions are not just about national justice, it's about global justice. So, I don't know, some reflections. I think the Jet E offerings and the climate finance offerings aren't suited to our needs. And the overall architecture discriminates against developing countries playing equitably in this game.
Yeah, thank you for zooming us out into the global justice as well. Vincent, over to you.
I will largely second what you said as a practitioner on a daily basis. Complex, expensive, I would say clean or whatever sustainable debt. Very often you spend months and months trying to actually get the package together, and so much simpler just to go to traditional lending. One of the reasons, I guess, is the fact that we still haven't worked out whether we want to have something that is genuinely specific, or we just have done what all the banks have done and what we have done in terms of the industry is you take traditional financing and you have a green layer on top or a transition layer on top, and you try to make it look good. But in the end, it's actually more expensive. So now I'm going to be a horrible cynic here, and we'll come back to hard finance. Currently, it's very often cheaper to go for equity or traditional financing than actually go for green financing or transition financing. But also, if you count the cost, the number of guys you're going to get involved and trying to work out just to save a couple of basis points that eventually you will not get. And then you will find in a couple of days, and I'm not joking here, I've got an example, a couple of days you will get traditional financing. So I think one of the biggest problem is the fact that it's overtly complex. Point number one. Point number two is you made the point, it's a very good point. Sometimes the project level, because the projects are pretty small, and we are talking hundreds of millions, so that's what I call small. I mean, for some of the projects, it's actually hundreds of thousands of dollars, whatever the currency. It's actually not available. Very often, multilateral institutions or big banks like the big numbers. And therefore, unless you get the big number and then you subdivide, you actually find it very, very hard. So the truth is, we all would love to have specific financing for transition, clean energy, but most of the time it's traditional finance disguised as transition finance. I'm slightly provocative here, but that's the truth of the matter, really.
Yeah, let me turn to you, Gareth. You had the call out on MDBs and ticket sizes, so over to you.
Yeah. So I think a number of very interesting points coming up. First of all, on the 3% of global climate finance, I agree. I mean, it's and we take these figures from CPI, and actually at the African Development Bank, we have a target to increase Africa's share of global climate finance to 10% by 2030, and it's against the baseline of the 3% from CPI in 2020. And actually, I think the latest figure is it's fallen to 2.7% because the actual total amount of climate finance has gone up. Although I also heard that maybe you changed your methodology a little bit, so I don't know. But anyway, this is a critical indicator, and I also, I mean, I agree with you on the 8.5 billion that came for the Jet P in South Africa. I mean, you couldn't have made it more different and not talking to each other. It was disappointing that the donors weren't sufficiently or better coordinated to give something that could actually be more usefully applied. So I think, I mean, coming out of COP27, the MDBs were specifically named in the Sharm el-Sheikh declaration, I can't remember anyway, but, they specifically called on the MDBs and on the MDB shareholders to reform the MDBs. So I mean, they were telling us to become more efficient, but they were telling our shareholders, and particularly our donors, that they needed to make more money available. They needed to allow us to be more risk less risk averse, and so on, and to do more. So, there is movement in that direction to scale up the amount of funding that's available. The access to special drawing rights could really be quite a game changer in terms of the amount of money that could be made available, because we can leverage that 3 to 4 times. If we can get our hands on it. So, that is money that actually could make quite a significant difference and could impact upon debt restructuring in many countries. I think we also need to look at the role of the credit rating agencies. So they keep coming up. I mean, they're becoming the villains of the piece because, particularly in Africa, they have this perceived risk. And what I hear in Africa is that actually the default rate on African infrastructure projects is lower than in South America, and yet they still come back with these. Well, many countries aren't even credit rated in Africa, so it makes it very difficult to move forward in some of these things. Now, two positive things. Paris alignment is actually, it's going to have a big impact. It will take a little bit of time, but it is going to gain momentum. So all the MDBs now are Paris aligned, and for some of what we call our building blocks. And most importantly, it means that we can now only lend money to institutions that themselves are Paris aligned. So they have to have Paris alignment policy. And Paris alignment means that you are only allowed to invest in projects that contribute to low carbon, climate resilient, and just development. Now, that's not going to happen overnight because institutions have to put the policies in place. And the main way that we assess Paris alignment is to look at the long-term strategy and say, is this project part of the long-term strategy? Well, of course, most African projects don't have a long-term strategy. So countries don't have a long-term strategy yet. But we can look at the NDCs, we can look at other policy statements, and over time we will get there. And we're just launching the long-term strategy program with funding, hopefully, to help develop those long-term strategies. So there is movement, there is momentum going in the right way, and it should get easier for you to raise money for green, low carbon, climate resilient projects, and harder for entities to raise money for technologies that lock in fossil fuels. And that should cascade through the financial sector. And I think once it gains momentum, it will go quite quickly. So that's, I think, a bright spot on the horizon. And the other thing is that we're developing at the African Development Bank. We have a Green Banks, African Green Banks initiative. And a Green Bank is an institution that is specifically designed to mobilize concessional resources from the Green Climate Fund, also from DFIs and so on, to blend that with commercial finance to be able to lend more cheaply to green projects. And we're now working with 4 countries, so only 50 to go. But South Africa already has one, and we just got Rwanda, so maybe that's already 2 ticked off. But we have 2 in Cote d'Ivoire, CDC in Benin, and BNI in Cote d'Ivoire, and we're coming up to shortly to announce banks in Egypt and Morocco. And we've mobilized technical assistance money to help build capacity within existing institutions so that their investment officers learn about renewable energy projects, about just transition and so on, so they'll be able to understand the deals, and then we will help to capitalize them to lend concessional funds to green projects that will start to contribute. And I think the potential for green banks to mobilize large amounts of money is really quite significant, especially when you then scale that up across multiple countries. Then we really could start to mobilize quite a lot of money. So we're very excited about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Gareth. I think that point around the credit ratings and the perceived risk is really important. So another thing from that study, that 3% study, was that in Africa, only 14% of the climate finance is from the private sector, which is the next lowest region, I think, was South Asia or Southeast Asia, where it was about 30% from the private sector. So there's just a real dearth of private financing in Africa for climate. And that really, I think, comes from some of these perceived risks and the perhaps the injustices in the financial system. Let me turn over to you, Caleb, for your thoughts. Back to Vincent, and then I'm going to let the audience come in with a couple questions.
Thanks, Bella, for that. I think from where we're sitting as Eskom, from a South African context, yes, as Crispian has said, we need much more money in terms of funding the transition in Africa and in South Africa. But I think the part for us, 2 years down the line, there's $8.5 billion, which has grown to about just over $11 billion. It is available to South Africa in terms of contributing to the start of funding this transition, be it in the generation side, and more importantly, what we require in South Africa is the transmission grid expansion to allow for connectivity to the grid in terms of independent power producers, etc., and to utilize the sources of renewable technologies. So I think from we sitting, I think what will make us progress further from an Eskom perspective and a country perspective between ourselves as the state-owned entity, coupled with uh, environment in which we are uh, currently not allowed to borrow, but more importantly, how do you plan for this implementation and execution? As a country, I mean, from where I'm sitting, we need to see the integrated energy system talking to the integrated funding system. Many developing countries and entities that operate within that will have challenged and constrained balance sheets. And where we find ourselves, we would need the support of the fiscus here, whether it's in the form of guarantees, equity, etc. But until you start aligning the other side of the coin being the operational requirements with the funding and have this integrated plan, we know what's going to contribute, which part is going to be equity, which part is going to be guaranteed, which part is going to be debt financing. Because these projects are not 1 year projects. They long-term infrastructure projects, whether it's in the distribution sector, generation sector, or the transmission sector. And as a country, until we get to a point where, if you want to call it a better word, this master plan talks to each component. And as colleagues have said, the just transition is not just about the energy sector. We know in South Africa we need to deal with our rail infrastructure and logistics as well. So until you having that integrated plan, so at the end of the day, the product gets from the source to the end consumer, whether you're importing or exporting. That for me, where I'm sitting, is what we need to fix in South Africa. But if we keep focusing on everyone focusing on their small component and not putting the big puzzle together, I think we're missing the picture. The only other thing I would put on the table is you're never going to get a perfect solution. We are all learning. Let's do the Pareto principle of 80-20. We learn from our mistakes. We make sure we don't repeat it. But more importantly, as the global economy, let's share the learnings on the just energy transition or the just transition. At the end of the day, I think as someone has said that 1 ton of carbon reduction benefits the entire globe. So let's make sure those learning effects are shared quickly and efficiently, that everyone can benefit. Uh, other thing is, we talk about all this planning, lack of decision making and tiniest decision making. We like to calculate costs of many things. The one thing that we're not calculating is the opportunity cost of not making a decision for 2, 3 years, 5 years down the line. What is it costing the economy, the country, and the globe? So for me, I think while we're making and balancing these tough decisions, there is a cost of not making decisions which could be detrimental. You may not see it immediately, but it's going to cost us in the future. So for me, where I'm sitting, if you get 70% of your decisions correct, you are moving forward. Don't try to make it perfect. It's tough, but we are put in leadership roles to make decisions after consulting with the necessary stakeholders. Thank you.
Points I would like to add. The first one is on right. I mean, rating agencies are playing a slightly perverse role in all financing. Currently talking to the three of them, the main three of them, regarding the structure of our debt. And as soon as you say the word Egypt, they start having kittens, basically. And it's very interesting because let's have a bit of a poll. How many times has Egypt defaulted on its sovereign debt since 1945? Zero. How many times has Argentina defaulted on their sovereign debt? since 1945. 19 times. But occasionally, if you look at history, it's actually been easier to raise money in South America than it's been in Egypt. Funny. So when I stop talking about Egypt, I talk about South Africa, and they also start jittering a bit. So that's the first thing, which is the rating system does not actually take into account, and that's the second point you were making. I wanted to make it anyway, which is externalities. We don't know how to measure externalities. We are so happy when we mention them, but we try to actually see the impact 4, 5, 6 years down the road, as you rightly say. There's a very simple way to fix it. The only one which everybody would agree on is a global carbon price. Sorry to raise that. This is not the topic today, but the global carbon price will, within 5 to 10 years, make it absolutely clear what the benefit is, at least on the power side. And this is the way where rating agencies would actually come and start measuring why we should actually still come back to what was horribly called the greenium, which is the fact that green debt was actually cheaper than traditional debt. And this actually premium or greenium has actually disappeared in the last 2 years, which is a problem for us. Because then when we finance ourselves, we come back to the traditional. Whether we go back to traditional or green doesn't make any difference. Financing, as we all know as companies, is the most important thing for big projects. Sorry, I stepped in, but I think it was important.
Yeah, that's great. Certainly what I was hoping that we could do in the panel is not necessarily take things in perfect order. Let me turn to the audience, see if we have a few questions. I have one here, one there. Maybe we'll take one more. Think about it as these two ask their questions. I don't know if there's a mic, so I will just try not to trip over all the cords and come over to you.
Thank you very much. Very interesting panel discussion. So I had two questions. One is about scalability, going back a bit to the indicators you were mentioning. We've done some work at the UN level trying to measure just transition, and echoing what you said, you cannot measure it the same way in one country compared to another, and so on. So as you use these monitoring and evaluation frameworks, how can you scale this up in different contexts? And going into a bit the nitty-gritty of the actual data that needs to be collected, because when we did this work, there's the high-level principles. So you could use existing frameworks, building on ILO guidelines or others that are more locally relevant, for example. But then you actually need to collect the data on what are the wage gaps, what is the level of the public perceptions on surveys and other aspects. So how can you get this data, because sometimes it's scattered across different agencies, statistical agencies, ministries of energy, and so on. And then I guess the second question is also, how are you using this data? Because it's one thing to report it, then to actually use the data to change policies in place and to move towards implementation, I guess, is also really important. So as part of the work you're doing on the reporting and verification, is there something also about using this data to change project at a project level or at a more macro level, how the just transition is being implemented?
Yeah, thank you. I've got two questions, or basically remark type of questions. The first question is related to also related to broaden up a little bit the topic of just transition, because what I equally miss in the discussion often is the agricultural sector and the need for transitions there, and basically also combined with the adaptation question. I think it's very important to raise that, especially also for Africa. So please reflect to that. The second question is, well, I'm Carl Kronenberg from the CEB, also a multilateral development bank. I was very pleased to hear from you that you basically meant that Paris alignment is about mitigation, it's about adaptation, but it's also about just transition. But if we look at the principles that have been published quite recently by the MDBs, the whole chapter and the principles are not mentioning just transition. So I really think we should work on this omission.
Does anyone else want to jump in? Deepak?
Thank you. Very brief remarks, actually. I was particularly interested in the real practitioner of business saying that traditional finance is actually being packaged and presented as transition finance. I think that's a starting point where, as we look for novel and hopefully some level of innovative solutioning in the traditional financing, structuring, project financing landscape, there is a bigger conversation to be held. And that bigger conversation is about giving some practical impetus to the global conversation that is taking place about the reform of, and therefore hopefully freeing up capital availability in the developing world. I just want to start at the level of innovation in the current scheme of things. South Africa has just launched, with the help of CPI, its own climate finance report. What we're seeing is that there is an increase, welcome increase, in climate finance 2019 to 21, however insufficient to close the gap between what we need and what we're actually getting. Secondly, 91% of that which has flown to climate finance outcomes in South Africa has been raised in the domestic capital and financial markets, which raises another issue, and that is, where is the international finance? And in what form is it being packaged? Anil, we did not get together when you were not able to get together at the BRICS Summit, but I think the NDB is doing some very interesting work to make available local currency denominated loans, because by the time you take the high interest environment, slap on that country risk rating if it exists. If it doesn't, then you maximize on it. And then you add to that the kind of premium that is required for the hedging of local currencies, you have a problem. You have a cost of capital that cannot be hurdled by any sort of project that is going to get its revenues in domestic currency. So my own view is that someone needs to find the answer to the question of country risk, interest rate risk, as well as, most importantly, FX risk, in order to bring the cost of the capital stack down to bearable levels that allows entrepreneurs to get on with the job of implementing their projects for return.
The panel, because we are the ones taking the debt, and it's probably you're the ones who can help shape it. But you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. But at the end of the day, I know we're supposed to talk very optimistically about these things, but reality is, when you raise money for a project, and this project is going to deliver benefits to society, just transition, etc. If you have the choice between a simpler package that costs you less and a very complex package that may never come to fruition and cost you actually not much less or just a bit more, of course you're going to go for the first one. Most of the time, keep in mind that we're under time pressure in development, which is sometimes that is missed by the overall environment. I mean, you have tenders, you have competition, and usually you end up, that's the reality of the business, you end up doing a lot of things in the last minute, and usually last minute stuff like plane tickets coming to Dubai this week, it costs you a lot of money.
So let me see, Crispin, if you have some thoughts on the data as well as you, Caleb. Just how do you use data? What data do you need to make the decisions that you are making, both kind of at the country level and at the business level? And maybe Gareth, I can turn to you on the question on the ag sector and what that means. Crispin, would you be up for coming in
Yeah, I
first?
mean, the data is absolutely key to making this happen. And you know, we mentioned earlier in the discussions that each country clearly is different. We're focused on national circumstances. Some are going to be very energy and mitigation dominated. Otherwise, others are going to have a far greater adaptation focus. So, yeah, I would agree. There's no one size fits all, but we're not tracking things that are, you know, completely foreign to each other. And I think there's a common set of metrics that, you know, maybe the right thing to think about is a toolbox. So, a sort of a toolbox that we can all work off and adapt to our own circumstances. And I do think, you know, some of these international agencies and the UN can play a much stronger role in coming up with and supporting that kind of toolbox to emerge.
Thank you.
What I want to add over and above from a data perspective and the impact of as we move forward and as Eskom transitions and what it's going to do to the low carbon trajectory. We talk about the emissions part, but I think the element that doesn't get enough airtime from an Eskom perspective and a country perspective is we are a water scarce resource country. And as you move away from coal, which takes up and consumes quite a bit of water, you will then start relieving that pressure in terms of water consumption, which again can link to the other question of how do you deal with the agricultural sector, irrigation, etc. So that is why I think as part of the discussion is you got to see this entire integrated picture, and more importantly in any integrated picture, sequencing and doing things in parallel is critical, because if you don't do a certain project, it has a knock-on effect on many other projects down the line. And I guess one of our biggest challenges as Eskom, and I think as a country, our ability to execute and implement projects, that's where we must look for partners to help us in terms of better and more efficient execution. Obviously, as we do that, there must be the element of transfer of skills so we can ensure that our communities are also then gets those skills to move forward in terms of future projects. So I think it's important to not only look at this from the one element, but holistically incorporate all these elements in terms of the planning, but really focus on the execution of the key projects that are going to contribute to growing the economy in South Africa. But I must come back to the timeline, and I mentioned that, and that is why that decision, also having the CFO hat on, not making decisions, and for 10 basis points here or there, you spend 18 months, 2 years to get this complex transaction done, when you could have done the simpler one in 3 months and already had the project on the bars. So I think that's the balance that needs to be made going forward.
Gareth, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Let me just to speak briefly on the data. And I think, as Caleb said, the Pareto principle, the 80-20, is important. Just get on and do it. Let's start gathering this data. As we analyze it, we will start to see which parameters are more useful and which are less useful. I think, we just need to get on and do it. And as I say, it'll be messy, but, we'll find a way through it. For the ag sector, indeed, it is a huge issue, and particularly for 600 million rain-fed farmers in Africa, who are facing, significant threat. Helping them transition to a climate resilient future is essential. We need to avoid not necessarily need to avoid it, but I mean, there's a risk of intensification and aggregating large areas of land and mechanization that would put particularly women, they would lose their incomes, often in the informal sector. So these are things that we need to take into consideration, and that's part of the stakeholder consultation. And that's going to have to start with education. So that they understand what the implications are and they can communicate or identify and then communicate their concerns. And the gentleman here on the funding, the local currency risk and so on, I mentioned the green banks. Green banks will specifically be tasked to mobilize and lend in local currency, and they can do that because they can tap into diaspora funds, which is a big source of finance that is underutilized, and they can also be recipients of funding that governments can raise through the imposition of levies or taxes, for example, on combustion engines and so on. They could collect money, or from carbon markets, they could collect money and put that into a green bank where it can then be used to lend in local currency. Thanks.
Yeah, very interesting. Certainly, there's some really nice examples in the US of green banks that have done.
And I was just going to say, sorry, the UK Green Investment Bank, they bankrolled the offshore wind industry. There's lots coming up in the US, and GCF is now funding a number, and the IMF Resilience Sustainability Trust is also channeling money, for example, in Jamaica through the Ministry of Finance into the Blue Green Bank in Jamaica.
Very interesting. So, just one more question, just maybe a bit of a lightning round question, but I want to know what you're optimistic about in this journey of just transition in South Africa and Africa broader. What is one thing you're optimistic about as we move forward, as we learn, as we apply the 80-20 rule and really try together to figure this out? But who would like to go first?
Yeah, I think from Eskom's perspective, I think the opportunity to work with the community, and to go through this journey together, and we can show and demonstrate that uh, companies, state-owned entities, private sector, and the community can work together. The one thing what we've seen in terms of South Africa's resilience, if we all get together as a country behind a certain project, it succeeds. And that's where we need the JET and the just transition to go to. Get the total buy-in, not just with a few stakeholders. Because until you do that, it's going to be a struggle. It's going to be an uphill battle. But the opportunities, I think we can't even calculate it at this point in time. So that for me is what I see as the light at the end of this energy and just transition, beyond just the energy, but all the other supply chains from a country perspective. Thanks.
I'll go next then. We'll do the proper order this time. Well, I'm rediscovering South Africa because I joined this company 8 months ago, and I had a week in South Africa 2 weeks ago, going through the finance and also the SECs and the B and all the. And now it's actually, it's very easy to be very cynical, in the sense that you can see all the trouble, and it's very easy to hear people being very negative. Now, when you spend a week there, you see a couple of things. The first one is the quality of people. May sound totally crazy, but the truth is, you talk to actually quality people, they're extremely highly educated, and they genuinely want to make it work. That are two important things. The second thing is the regulation, the legislation is actually pretty high quality, in the sense that if, as we are talking about just transition, if you really want to do it well, you can actually do it well within the framework of the regulation. And third, there is, again, I'm coming to my next generation type of thing. It's a bit easy either way, but it's still very important that the younger generation actually genuinely believes this has to be done, and therefore they're doing it. And that's what, I actually came into these meetings slightly cynical. I came out being a lot more optimistic about our own investment. At the end of the day, it's a return on capital employed issue for me. All I can see is probably we can extract a higher return and also do good things.
I've got three things I'm optimistic about. The role of the MDBs in the future. I think this is a real opportunity for us. Youth coming in, and I didn't mention it, but I mean, the timescale for just transition is such that people will transition out of the workplace, they will retire, and young people will come in. So there's an opportunity there to use that. And the third thing is I mentioned already is Paris alignment. I think this will have a big impact as it gains momentum. It will take some time, but as more and more institutions deploy Paris alignment policies, then we should see money flowing more easily in the right direction.
Lastly, from me, I mean, we've crossed a critical point in the global market. So, in the last 10 years, solar PV prices have come down 88%. Onshore wind prices have come down 70%. It's now cheaper to do a renewable energy dominant electricity system with batteries and some peaking power than any of the other archetypes, fossil fuels, coal, nuclear. So, what we need to unlock this transition at scale are to enable, the enabling regulatory reforms. And we've already done some of them in South Africa. So we lifted the cap on embedded generation. We've now got a bill in front of Parliament that creates an independent transmission operator and an open competitive electricity market. And we're seeing the private sector responding. There's 66 gigawatts of renewable energy projects in the pipeline under development, and 18 gigawatts of those are at an advanced stage. So this thing's moving. The transition's well underway, and our obligation is to make sure it's a just transition, that we manage the social and the economic consequences of it.
Great. Thank you so much. And please join me in thanking this wonderful panel. I've learned so much, and I hope that we continue to learn together over time. So thank you so much.
Thank you.